The summer I turned 31, I took a solo trip into the Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina, to a stretch of backcountry along Slick Rock Creek that I'd been visiting since college. I mention my age because it matters. I was not young and reckless, not chasing some idea of wilderness adventure. I was a man who had built a specific relationship with a specific landscape over more than a decade. The way some people build relationships with neighborhoods or churches, or the same diner booth every Sunday morning. I worked as a land surveyor for a civil engineering firm out of Asheville, which meant I spent my professional life measuring the earth in precise increments, and my weekends walking into places where precision gave way to something older. Slick Rock sits in the far southwestern corner of the state, pressed against the Tennessee border, a drainage of the Keogh Mountains where the ridgelines run in long, parallel folds, and the creek cuts through a gorge so deep that the sun only reaches the water for about 4 hours a day in midsummer. The trail in follows an old railroad grade from the logging era, wide enough that you forget you're walking into wilderness until the grade ends, and the path narrows to a single track that threads through rhododendron thickets so dense they form tunnels. I'd camped at the same site 11 times before this trip, a flat shelf of ground above a bend in the creek where a massive tulip poplar had fallen years ago and created a natural clearing. The tree was still there, its root ball tilted skyward like a wall, its trunk extending 40 feet across the clearing floor, slowly returning to soil. I liked that spot because the fallen tree gave you something to lean against while you cooked, and because the creek made a particular sound at that bend. A low continuous pour over a 4-foot ledge of rock that produced a white noise deep enough to feel in your chest. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late July, the air so humid that my glasses fogged the moment I stepped out of the truck at the trailhead. The forecast called for scattered thunderstorms through the weekend, which in the southern Appalachians means you will get rained on. The only question is how hard and how long. I'd packed my tarp, a freestanding tent with a full coverage fly, and enough dry layers to survive a washout. The hike in took about 2 hours, and by the time I reached my clearing, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. That particular shade of green-gray, that means the atmosphere is holding more water than it wants to. I set camp with the efficiency of long practice. Tent up, stakes driven, guy lines tensioned. Food bag hung from a limb of the fallen poplar, high enough to discourage bears, low enough that I could reach it with a trekking pole. I ate dinner, rice and canned chicken cooked on a pocket stove, sitting on the poplar trunk with my back against the root ball, watching the light drain out of the gorge the way water drains from a bathtub, slowly and then all at once. The first thunder rolled through at about 7, a long, low sound that traveled down the gorge like something being dragged across the sky. I cleaned my cook kit in the creek, hung it to dry, and got into the tent. Rain started around 8:30, not gradually, it arrived like someone turning a valve. One moment the forest was holding its breath in that electric stillness that precedes a mountain storm, and the next the canopy was roaring. The sound on the tent fly was immediate and enormous, a sustained white noise that merged with the creek, until the entire gorge was a single continuous sound, like standing inside a machine. I'd been through dozens of storms in this gorge. The acoustics of the place amplified everything. The steep walls channeled wind and rain and thunder into something that felt personal, directed, as though the weather was aware of you specifically. I'd learned to find it soothing. That night, I did not find it soothing. The unease started small, a feeling, nothing more. The kind of low-frequency alertness that your body produces before your mind has identified the cause. I was lying in my sleeping bag with my headlamp off, listening to the storm, and I became aware of a wrongness in the sound. Not a new sound, a subtraction. The creek had gone quiet, not quieter, quiet. The 4-foot ledge that had been producing a constant chest-deep pour since I'd arrived was silent. The rain was still hammering the canopy, the wind was still moving through the gorge, but the creek, The creek that had been the loudest single element in this landscape for the 11 visits I'd made to this site was not making sound. I lay there for several minutes, trying to process this. Creeks don't go silent during rainstorms. They get louder, the runoff feeds them, the water rises. The pour over the ledge should have intensified, not stopped. I thought about flash floods, the possibility that a surge of water had overtopped the ledge and turned the pour into a smooth, silent sheet, but that didn't match the acoustics. A flooded creek is louder, not quieter. A flooded creek is a freight train. This was absence. This was the sound of water that had stopped moving. I unzipped the tent door and pointed my headlamp toward the creek. The beam cut through the rain in a cone of silver lines and landed on the water. The creek was there. It was full, higher than I'd ever seen it. Bank to bank, the surface dark and fast, but it was moving without sound. I watched it for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, trying to understand what I was seeing. The water was flowing. I could see leaves and debris moving on the surface. Could see the current pushing against the rocks at the edge. But it was silent, completely, perfectly silent, as though someone had muted that one element of the world while leaving everything else at full volume. And then I saw the light upstream, maybe 200 yards, where the gorge curved and the creek disappeared behind a shoulder of rock. A light, not a flashlight. The color was wrong. It was pale, almost blue, with the quality of bioluminescence, the kind of light that looks wet. It was below the waterline. I could see it through the surface of the creek, a glow moving slowly. Downstream, submerged, following the creek bed at a walking pace. The rain was coming down so hard that the surface of the water was a chaos of splashes and ripples, and through all of that, the light held steady, moving with a deliberateness that made my stomach drop, because things that move like that are choosing to move. I watched it come closer. The glow intensified as it approached, and I could see it illuminating the creek bed from below. The smooth stones, the underwater grasses pressed flat by the current. The sediment stirred into clouds by whatever was producing the light. It passed the point directly below my campsite, maybe 40 feet from where I knelt in the tent door, and I could see that the light source was roughly the size of a person. Not shaped like a person, just occupying the approximate volume of a person. A mass of pale luminescence moving through water that should have been only 2 or 3 feet deep, but seemed, where the light was, to be deeper, much deeper. The glow extended down in a way that defied the creek's actual depth, as though the light existed in a space below the creek bed that wasn't there when you looked at it in daylight. It passed my camp in about 90 seconds, slow, patient. The light moved downstream, following the curve of the gorge, dimming gradually as distance and rain intervened, until it was a faint suggestion and then nothing, and the moment it disappeared. Around the downstream bend, the creek came back. The sound returned in an instant, the full, roaring pour over the ledge, the rush of high water against the banks. As though someone had pressed play on a recording that had been paused. The volume of it after the silence was almost painful. I did not sleep. I sat in the tent door with my headlamp off, and I watched the creek until dawn. The rain stopped around 4 in the morning, and the sky went from black to gray to the pale, washed blue that follows a mountain storm. I broke camp at first light, packed everything wet, didn't bother with breakfast, hiked out in the early morning fog with my boots squelching on the muddy trail and my pack heavier than it should have been because everything was soaked. At the trailhead, I met a day hiker getting ready to go in, an older man, local, wearing a faded Nantahala Outdoor Center cap. I asked him, as casually as I could, whether he'd ever seen anything strange on the creek at night. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said his grandfather used to talk about the creek lights, said they'd been seen for as long as anyone could remember. Said the Cherokee had a word for them that he couldn't pronounce, but that translated to something like, the ones who walk the water when it sleeps. He said his grandfather believed the lights were old, not ghosts, not spirits, just old, older than the mountains. He said his grandfather said the water goes quiet for them because even the creek knows to be still when they pass. I asked him what they were. He shrugged and said that was the wrong question. The right question, he said, was what they wanted. And the answer to that was, nobody knew, because everybody who'd seen them had done exactly what I'd done. Watched from a distance and let them pass. And that, he said, was probably the right thing to do. I've been back to Nantahala since then. I've hiked other sections of the creek, in daylight, in good weather, but I have not camped at that site again. And I will not camp beside any creek when rain is forecast. The gorge is still beautiful. The water still pours over that ledge with a sound you can feel in your ribs. But I know now that the sound can stop, and I know what it means when it does. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to Fear Begins and hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who enjoys these kinds of stories. I'd also love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening. From your support means everything to me and keeps these stories coming. Now let's continue. My wife and I spent 3 years camping the Superior Hiking Trail in northern Minnesota before the night at Split Rock that ended it. We were the kind of couple that planned trips around weather windows and trail conditions the way other people plan around restaurant reservations. And the stretch of trail between Split Rock Lighthouse State Park and Beaver Bay was our favorite. A ridge walk above Lake Superior that drops through birch forest to campsites perched on basalt cliffs some 100 feet above the water. We'd done it 6 times in every season except deep winter, and we'd developed the particular intimacy with a landscape that comes from returning to it until its rhythms become your own. The trip in question was late September, which on the north shore is the hinge between autumn and something harder. The birches were bare, the aspens were dropping the last of their gold, and the lake had turned the slate gray that it holds from October through April, a color that looks less like water and more like a metal that hasn't decided whether to be liquid or solid. The forecast called for a cold front moving in overnight, bringing rain and temperatures in the low 40s. We'd packed for it: rain layers, insulated sleeping pads, a 4-season tent rated for winds that we'd never actually tested in serious wind because the ridgeline sites were sheltered on 3 sides by forest. We set camp at Site 9, a backcountry spot on a small promontory above the lake, tucked into a stand of white cedar that had been shaped by decades of prevailing wind into forms that looked like they were trying to walk inland. The site had a steel fire ring, a flat tent pad of packed earth and gravel, and a bear box bolted to a post. We'd stayed there twice before. The view was the reason. You could see 15 miles of shoreline in each direction, and on clear nights the Milky Way arched over the lake with a brightness that made you understand why people once navigated by stars. We ate dinner early, freeze-dried pad thai that my wife had gotten good at doctoring with sriracha and crushed peanuts we carried in a Ziploc, and cleaned up with the efficiency of people who have done the same campsite choreography together enough times that it becomes a kind of choreography, each person knowing which task they own without discussion. Food in the bear box, cook kit wiped and stowed, boots unlaced and placed under the vestibule with the solace up so they'd drain if the rain blew sideways. We got into the tent around 7. The rain started at 8 light at first, the kind that whispers on a tent fly and makes you grateful to be dry and horizontal. By 9 it was steady, and the wind had picked up, pushing off the lake in gusts that made the tent walls flex inward and snap back with a sound like a sail. Luffing, my wife fell asleep quickly. She always could, in any conditions, a talent I'd envied for the entire length of our marriage and never once replicated. I lay awake and listened. What I heard was the lake. Superior makes sounds that no other body of water I've encountered makes. In calm weather, it laps at the basalt shelves with a rhythm that's almost mechanical. In storms, it produces a sound that's less like waves and more like breathing, a deep, tidal inhalation as each swell builds, a pause at the crest, and a long exhalation as it collapses against the cliff face. The spray reaches our campsite in heavy weather, You can taste the iron in it. That night, the lake was loud. The swells were building with the front, and each impact against the cliff sent a vibration through the rock that I could feel through the tent floor, through the sleeping pad, through the ground itself. The rain was heavier now, and the wind was steady at maybe 20 miles an hour, with gusts that pushed the tent walls flat against my face for a second before releasing. Around 10:30, I heard a voice. I need to be precise about this, because precision is the only defense I have against the possibility that I imagined it. The voice was coming from the lake side of the campsite, from the direction of the cliff edge, which was about 30 feet from our tent. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling a name, not my name, not my wife's name, a name I didn't recognize. It was saying the name over and over, at intervals of about 5 seconds, with the particular cadence of someone calling a child who has wandered too far. Patient but concerned. The tone you use when you're not yet afraid, but you're starting to be. I lay still and listened. The voice was clear between gusts, muffled by wind and rain, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably a voice forming syllables with intent and meaning. I checked my watch. 10:37. I listened for another 2 minutes. The voice continued. Same name, same cadence, same direction, coming from the cliff edge, from the side of the campsite, where there was nothing but a 30-foot strip of rock and then a 100-foot vertical drop to the lake. I woke my wife. I put my hand on her shoulder, and she came awake the way she always did. Instantly and completely, without confusion, I whispered that I heard someone outside. She listened. I watched her face in the dim light that filtered through the rain fly. Watched the concentration settle in. After about 30 seconds, she looked at me and whispered back that she heard it too. We lay there together and listened to a woman's voice calling a name from the edge of a cliff in the rain at 10:30. At night in a backcountry campsite, that was a 5-mile hike from the nearest road. I should have stayed in the tent. Every rational part of my mind was telling me that something about this was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of unusual, but wrong in the sense of impossible. There was no trail to this campsite from the cliffside. There was no way to reach the promontory from below without climbing gear. The nearest campsite was 1.5 miles north. No one walks the Superior hiking trail in the dark, in the rain, in late September. But the voice sounded distressed. It sounded like someone who needed help, and I am, despite everything that happened, someone who responds to that. I put on my rain jacket and my boots, and I unzipped the tent. The rain hit my face like a handful of gravel thrown from close range. I turned on my headlamp and swept the beam across the campsite, the fire ring, its ash turning to gray paste. In the downpour, the bare box beaded with water, reflecting the beam in a dull metallic flash, the cedar trees bending in the wind with their branches trailing leeward like wet hair. The beam reached the cliff edge, that abrupt line where rock ended and air began, and I walked toward it, slowly, testing each footfall on the wet basalt, because a slip here would not be the kind you recover from, and because every step closer to that edge felt like a step against the current of something my body understood better than my mind. The lake smell was stronger here, that mineral iron-tinged coldness that Superior breathes into the air when the waves are working the rock. The voice had stopped the moment I'd unzipped the tent, the moment the zipper sound had cut through. The rain, the voice had stopped. I reached the cliff edge and looked down. My headlamp beam was strong, 1,000 lumens, and it cut through the rain and the spray and hit the water 100 feet below. The swells were enormous. Dark green walls that rose and collapsed against the basalt with a sound like something heavy being dropped from a great height. There was no one on the cliff. There was no one on the rocks below. There was nothing between my feet and the surface of Lake Superior but open air and rain. I stood there for maybe a minute. The wind was pushing at my back, pushing me toward the edge, and I had the sudden visceral understanding that this was what the voice had been for. Not to call someone, to bring someone to the edge. I stepped back 3 steps, and then I turned and walked to the tent, and I got in and I zipped it shut, and I told my wife that there was no one out there, She looked at me, and she didn't say anything, but I could see in her face that she understood something I hadn't said. We both heard it. We both knew what we heard, and we both knew that whoever, whatever, had been calling from the cliff edge had not been standing on the cliff edge because there was nowhere to stand. We didn't sleep. We lay in the tent and listened to the rain and the wind and the lake, and the voice did not come back. I held my wife's hand in the dark, and neither of us spoke, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it more real. And some part of both of us was still hoping that if we didn't speak about it, it might retroactively become the wind or a bird or anything other than what it had been. In the morning, the front had passed and the sky was clear and the lake was flat and the birches on the ridge were bare and beautiful, and the world looked like nothing had happened. We packed out in silence, moving through the campsite routine with a carefulness that felt less like efficiency and more like the kind of quiet you maintain in a place where someone has recently been hurt. On the drive back to Duluth, down Highway 61 with the lake appearing and disappearing through the trees on our right, my wife said one thing about it. She said the name the voice had been calling sounded like Margit. She said it sounded old. Not the voice itself, but the name, the way it was being said, as though it belonged to a time before this one. I've looked into it since. In the way that people look into things they wish they could explain away. Margit is a Scandinavian name, common among the Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who settled the North Shore in the 1800s. Many of them were fishermen who worked the lake in open boats. Many of them drowned. The North Shore between Split Rock and Beaver Bay has claimed more vessels than any other stretch of Superior's coastline. And the lake does not give up its dead. The water is too cold, even in summer, for the bacteria that create the gases that bring bodies to the surface. The bodies stay down. They stay in the lake. We don't camp the North Shore anymore. We switch to the boundary waters, to inland lakes where the water is warm and shallow, and you can see the bottom and nothing calls to you from edges you shouldn't approach. My wife and I don't talk about that night, but sometimes, on autumn evenings when the wind picks up and the temperature drops and the air takes on that metallic quality that reminds me of lake spray, she'll look at me from across the room with an expression that tells me she's hearing it again, the same way I'm hearing it, a woman's voice calling a name into the rain, patient and concerned, from a place where no woman could possibly have been standing. I managed a small primitive campground in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky for 4 seasons. From the spring I turned 26 to the autumn I turned 29. The campground was called Coomer Ridge, 12 sites on a wooded bench above the Red River Gorge. No electric hookups, no running water, just pit toilets and fire rings and a gravel loop road that turned to mud every time it rained, which in the gorge was often. My job was maintenance and oversight, the kind of work that sounds romantic, until you've unclogged your 3rd pit toilet in a week and spent an afternoon replacing a fire grate that someone tried to use as a grill for a whole deer leg. I emptied the trash cans, cleaned the facilities, replaced what needed replacing, and I kept a rain gauge at the entrance kiosk because the Forest Service liked to track precipitation in the gorge for erosion modeling. The job came with a small cabin up the ridge, a 1-room structure with a wood stove and a propane range, and a window that looked down through the trees at the campground loop with a view that, in 4 years, I came to know the way a lighthouse keeper knows the water. By its moods, its patterns, the small variations that signal a change in conditions. The rain gauge is how this story starts. It was a simple acrylic tube mounted on a post, graduated in tenths of an inch, the kind you can buy at a hardware store for $8. I checked it every morning at 7, recorded the number on a clipboard in the kiosk, and emptied it. This was the most mundane part of my job. And I mention it because the mundane is where the story lives, the small, repeatable acts that constitute a routine, that give your days structure and rhythm, that you perform so many times they become invisible, which is exactly when the invisible starts using them to get your attention. The gauge was positioned at the entrance to the campground, about 200 yards from the nearest campsite and 50 feet from the gravel road. To reach it, you walked down a short path from the kiosk through a stand of Virginia pine. The path was maybe 30 feet long, worn to bare soil by my daily passage. I walked it every morning for 4 years. I could have walked it in my sleep during my third season. A pattern emerged that I didn't notice at first because it was too small, too specific, too embedded in the routine to register as unusual. On mornings after heavy rain, specifically, mornings when the gauge showed more than an inch of overnight accumulation, there were footprints on the path, not boot prints, not shoe prints, bare footprints, pressed into the mud of the path, leading from the gravel road to the rain gauge and back. The prints were smaller than mine, maybe a women's size 6 or 7, and they were always fresh, made after the rain had stopped but before the mud had dried. Someone was walking barefoot to my rain gauge in the middle of the night, after rainstorms, and walking back. The first few times I didn't think much of it. Campgrounds attract all kinds of people, and barefoot walks in the rain aren't inherently alarming. I assumed it was a camper. Maybe someone who liked the feel of mud between their toes. Someone checking the gauge out of the same idle curiosity that makes people read historical markers they'll never remember. But the pattern continued, every heavy rain, every time, and when I started paying closer attention, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The gauge was being read but not emptied. I could tell because on those mornings, the water level in the gauge was exactly right. It matched the rainfall, but the gauge had been handled. The acrylic tube was rotated slightly on its mount, about a quarter turn clockwise, the way it would rotate if someone gripped it and leaned in close to read the graduated markings at eye level. Someone was coming to the rain gauge after every heavy rain, reading the measurement, and leaving. I started checking the campsite registrations against the pattern. On 7 of the 12 occasions I tracked over the rest of that season, the campground was empty. No registered campers, no vehicles in the lot, no one within a mile of the gauge except me, sleeping in my cabin 400 yards up the ridge. The barefoot prints were there on those empty nights just the same, appearing on the path between midnight and dawn, small and precise and always the same size, the same depth, the same stride length. I set up a trail camera in late August, pointed at the rain gauge from a tree about 15 feet away. The kind of camera hunters use, infrared flash, motion triggered, timestamps on every image, the same model that had reliably captured deer, turkey, and the occasional black bear on the game trails around the campground for 2 seasons, without a single failure. The first storm after I installed it dropped 1.5 inches overnight. I walked to the gauge at 7 the next morning with the particular alertness of someone expecting an answer. The prints were there, fresh in the mud, the familiar small bare feet walking their familiar path. The gauge was rotated, and the trail camera had 12 images, 12 exposures, triggered at intervals of about 2 minutes between 1:15 and 1:40 in the morning. Every single image showed the rain gauge, the path, the post, the pine trees and the green wash of the infrared flash. Nothing else, no person, no animal, no shadow, no blur. No suggestion of movement of any kind. Whatever was walking that path, reading that gauge, and leaving those prints was not registering on a motion-triggered camera that was functioning correctly. I tested it afterward by walking the path myself 3 times, and it captured me on every pass, centered in the frame, clear as a portrait. I told my supervisor, a man named Dale who'd worked for the Forest Service for 22 years, and who approached the world with the pragmatic certainty of someone who had seen enough strange things in the backcountry to have developed a taxonomy of explanations, all of which were natural. He drove out, looked at the prints, looked at the camera images on my laptop, and said it was probably a raccoon walking in its own tracks in a way that resembled human prints. I didn't argue with him because I wanted him to be right, because the alternative was something I didn't have a framework for. But raccoon prints looked nothing like human prints. Raccoons have 5 toes, distinct claw marks, a pad structure that's closer to a hand than a foot, and raccoons don't walk in a straight line from a road to a rain gauge and back with the purposeful stride of someone who knows where they're going. I stopped sleeping well after that. I lay in my cabin on rainy nights and listened to the water on the metal roof and the drip from the eaves and the occasional creak of the wood stove cooling. And I thought about the path and the gauge and the small bare footprints that appeared on it with the regularity of a ritual performed by someone who took the rain very seriously. In October of that year, the last month of my 3rd season, we had a 3-day rain event that dropped 4 inches on the 2nd morning. I walked to the gauge and found the prints, but this time, they didn't stop at the gauge. The footprints continued past the gauge, off the path, through the pine stand, and down the slope toward the campground loop road. I followed them. They led to campsite number 7, the most isolated site on the loop, tucked back into a rhododendron thicket. At the end of a short spur, the prints circled the fire ring once, approached the picnic table, and stopped at the bench on the north side. In the mud on the bench seat, the flat wooden plank where you'd sit, there was an impression, not a handprint, not a footprint, a body print, the shape of someone small who had sat on the bench in the rain, in the mud, and stayed there long. Enough to leave the impression of their thighs, their hips, the backs of their arms resting at their sides. Whoever it was had been sitting there in the rain, in the dark, in an empty campground, sitting and facing north, facing the ridge, facing my cabin. I requested a transfer the following spring and moved to a campground in the Red River Gorge geological area, 4 miles away by road, but far enough that Coomer Ridge became someone else's responsibility. Someone else's morning walk to the gauge. Someone else's footprints to find or not find. I asked the ranger who replaced me at Coomer Ridge about the rain gauge a few months later, over coffee at the Slade gas station. The kind of conversation where both people know what's being discussed, but neither wants to say it directly. He said he'd noticed the footprints. He said he'd started checking the gauge later in the morning after the sun had dried the mud, because he didn't want to see the prints fresh. He said he'd stopped checking the gauge in the dark entirely. He said he didn't want to talk about the bench at Site 7, but the way he said it, the way his hand tightened on his coffee cup and his eyes moved to the window and then back to me, told me he'd found exactly what I'd found and understood exactly what I'd understood. The gauge is still there. The Forest Service still collects precipitation data from that site. The Virginia pines still line that 30-foot path, and the mud still holds impressions after heavy rain. And I imagine, on the mornings after the kind of storm that drops more than an inch overnight, someone still walks that path and reads the numbers and walks back, leaving small bare footprints in the mud that no camera has ever captured and no one has ever explained. I don't know what they want with the numbers. I don't know why the rain is the condition. I only know that they come, and they measure, and they leave. And they have been doing it longer than the gauge has been there, which means they were measuring something before there was a gauge, and that thought, the thought of what they were measuring before we gave them a number to read, is the one that keeps me awake. I used to camp under railroad trestles. That sounds stranger than it is if you didn't grow up in the kind of rural Appalachian county where trestles were the landmarks, where every creek valley had one, a rusting iron bridge spanning a hollow, 200 feet wide, carrying a rail line that might see one train a day or none at all, with a flat, dry patch of ground underneath that stayed sheltered from rain and wind and offered the kind of privacy that teenagers and drifters and people who wanted to be alone without explanation found useful. I grew up in Fayette County, West Virginia, along the New River, and by the time I was 17, I'd camped under 4 different trestles within 20 miles of my mother's house. The one I'm going to tell you about crossed Dunloop Creek about 6 miles south of Fayetteville, on a spur line that served a coal operation that had been closed since the early 90s. The trestle was old, built in the 1920s. according to a plate riveted to one of the support columns, and it had the particular beauty of industrial structures that have outlasted their purpose. The iron going orange with rust, the wooden ties above warping and splitting, the whole structure groaning in high wind with a sound that was almost musical, almost like a voice humming a note it couldn't quite find. I camped under that trestle maybe 30 times between the ages of 17 and 22. It was my place in the way that certain locations become your place when you're young and don't have money and need somewhere to go that isn't home and isn't a parking lot and isn't the same 3 blocks of a small town where everyone knows your truck. I kept a camp chair there, tucked behind one of the concrete footings, and a coffee can with waterproof matches and a few tea candles. There was a flat area of packed earth and creek gravel that stayed dry even in downpours, sheltered by the fogs. Trestle above the way, a porch is sheltered by a roof, and I'd swept it clean so many times that it had the worn, maintained quality of a room. The creek ran about 50 feet from the base of the trestle, shallow enough to wade in summer, and the hollow was narrow enough that the trestle above acted as a ceiling, keeping the ground dry even in hard rain. I went there to read, to think, to drink beer I was too young to buy, and eventually to process the particular kinds of sadness that accumulate in your early 20s when you're watching everyone you know either leave or settle in ways that look like giving up. The trestle didn't judge. It was the most reliable structure in my life at that time, which says something about the life. The night I'm describing was in April, the spring I was 21. I'd driven out after a fight with my girlfriend, the kind of fight that's really about something larger than whatever started it, where the surface disagreement is a proxy for questions about whether you're building a life together or just occupying the same space. And I'd set up my chair under the trestle and built a small fire in a ring of creek stones and sat there watching the flames and listening to the rain fall on the hollow around me while the trestle above kept me dry. It was a steady, warm rain, the kind that April produces in the mountains when the air is still deciding whether it's winter or spring. Warm enough that the rain felt soft on your face, but cool enough that you wanted the fire. The creek was up, running fast and brown with runoff, carrying leaves and small branches from the slopes above with a turbulent, muscular sound that filled the hollow with a white noise I found, as I always did, deeply calming. Something about the constancy of it, the way it went on without requiring anything from me, made my own problems feel appropriately small. I was alone. I'd checked the hollow on my way in, as I always did, out of habit rather than concern. The trestle attracted the occasional hiker or fisherman, but rarely at night, and never in the rain. The nearest house was 1.5 miles down the creek road. The nearest streetlight was in Fayetteville, 6 miles north. The darkness under a trestle on a rainy night in a West Virginia hollow is a specific kind of darkness, the kind that has weight and texture, that sits on your skin like humidity and makes the circle of your firelight feel like the only warm room in an empty building around. Midnight. The fire had burned down to coals, and I was considering whether to add wood or let it die and go to sleep. And I heard something on the trestle above me. Footsteps on the railroad ties. The sound was unmistakable, the hollow, resonant thud of someone walking on wooden ties over an iron frame, each step producing a note that rang through the structure and down through the support columns into the ground. The trestle was about 60 feet above me, and the sound carried clearly through the rain, each footfall distinct, unhurried, evenly spaced. Someone was walking across the trestle in the rain. At midnight I looked up. The underside of the trestle was a grid of iron beams and cross bracing, and between the ties I could see the sky, a narrow strip of charcoal gray between each pair of wooden sleepers. I watched for a silhouette, for the interruption of that gray strip as a body passed over it. The footsteps were moving from the south end of the trestle toward the north. Directly above me, slow and even, and I could not see anyone. The strips of sky between the ties remained unbroken. No shadow passed over them. No shape blocked the faint ambient light. The footsteps crossed directly above my head. I could place them with precision, could hear the specific tie that each foot landed on, and there was nothing there. The trestle was empty. The footsteps continued to the north end, a distance of maybe 200 feet from where I first heard them, and then they stopped, not faded, stopped. The last footstep landed, and then there was only the rain and the creek and the iron structure ticking and groaning, the way old metal does when it's been stressed. I sat in my chair and I did not move. The coals of my fire pulsed with that deep orange that means they're almost done. And the shadows they cast on the concrete footing beside me shifted with each pulse like something breathing. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. The rain, the creek, the trestle settling. I began to convince myself that I'd heard the structure itself, the thermal expansion and contraction of iron, the movement of ties in their brackets, the kind of sounds that old bridges make that you could, if you were alone and tired and upset, interpret as footsteps. Then the footsteps came back. From the north end, walking south, same pace, same weight, same resonant thud on the wooden ties. And this time, they stopped directly above me. I could hear the last step land on a tie that was, by my estimation, no more than 5 feet to my left and 60 feet above. And then nothing. The footsteps did not resume. Whatever had been walking was now standing on the trestle directly above the place where I sat. I looked up. The gap between the ties at that point was about 6 inches wide. Through it, I could see the sky. I could see rain falling, and I could see, or I believe I could see. And the difference between those two things has consumed more of my thinking in the years since then I'd like to admit. The faintest darkening of that gap, not a shape, not a figure, just a shadow where a shadow shouldn't have been. A slight dimming of the already dim sky visible through the ties, as though something was standing above me and blocking a fraction of the light that I shouldn't have been able to see in the first place. I left. I didn't pack the chair. I didn't scatter the fire. I stood up and I walked to my truck and I drove back to Fayetteville, with the heater on and the radio loud and my hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, with the white-knuckled intensity of someone who is holding on to the normal world with physical force. I didn't look in the rearview mirror because I didn't want to see the trestle receding into the dark behind me. Didn't want to see the hollow closing around the space I'd just left. Didn't want the possibility, however irrational, of seeing something standing on the trestle, watching me leave. I went back a week later in daylight, on a Tuesday morning, with the sun high and the creek back to its normal level, and the hollow looking the way it always looked in spring. Green, wet, ordinary. A place where nothing more threatening than a copperhead might be found sunning on a rock. The chair was where I'd left it. The fire ring was cold. The ashes gray and scattered by wind. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing, on the concrete footing beside my chair. The smooth, vertical surface of the footing that faced the spot where I'd been sitting. There were marks, scratches long, vertical scratches in the concrete, grouped in sets of 4, as though someone had dragged their fingernails down the surface while standing directly beside my chair. The scratches were deep enough to feel with my fingertip, deep enough to have removed a layer of the concrete surface, and they were fresh. The concrete dust from them was still on the ground at the base of the footing, a fine gray powder that hadn't been washed away by rain, because the trestle above had kept it dry. The scratches started at about 6 feet off the ground and ran downward for about 2 feet. 4 parallel lines, evenly spaced, with the slight curve that fingers make when they're dragged across a surface force. I picked up the chair. I walked to the truck. I drove back to Fayetteville, and I put the chair in my mother's garage. And I have not been back to that trestle, or any other trestle in Fayette County since then. And when I drive the creek road now, which I do sometimes because it connects to Route 19, I don't slow down, and I don't look toward the hollow, and I keep the radio playing something with words, because the silence in that stretch of road feels too much like the silence that fell between the footsteps on the ties. My brother and I had a tradition of camping one weekend every October in the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. We'd been doing it since I was 14 and he was 17. And by the year this happened, 2019, when I was 32, we'd built 18 years of history with that forest, with the particular stretch of it along the Tionesta Creek drainage, where the old-growth hemlocks grow so tall and so thick that the forest floor is permanently dim, even at noon, even in summer when the canopy is full, and the light that reaches the ground has been filtered through so many layers of green that it arrives with the quality of light at the bottom of a swimming pool. We always camped at the same general area, a dispersed camping zone off Forest Road 133, where you could drive in on a 2-track and find a flat spot among the hemlocks within earshot of the creek. No designated sites, no facilities, no other people most of the time. The appeal was the solitude and the trees. Some of those hemlocks are 300 years old, their trunks wider than a car, their bark furrowed into ridges deep enough to fit your fist into. Standing among them feels like standing in a building, a cathedral, people always say. And the comparison is earned because the space has that same quality of enclosed vastness, of being inside something that is simultaneously open and contained. That October, we drove in on a Friday afternoon under skies that had been gray since dawn, the kind of low uniform overcast that settles onto the Allegheny Plateau in autumn and stays for days, turning the world monochrome in a way that should feel depressing, but in the context of this particular forest felt appropriate, as though the forest preferred muted light, preferred the intimacy that gray skies create between the canopy and the ground. The forecast was rain overnight, clearing by morning, standard autumn weather for that part of Pennsylvania, where the moisture comes off Lake Erie and hits the plateau and drops everything it's carrying. We found our usual spot, a flat bench of ground between two massive hemlocks with the creek about 100 yards downhill through the timber. My brother backed the truck in on the 2-track until the trees got too tight, and we carried our gear the last 100 yards. On foot, our boots crunching on hemlock needles that lay several inches deep, the accumulation of decades of fall, creating a floor so soft that walking on it felt like walking on carpet in a house that had been empty for a very long time. We set up our tents side by side, about 15 feet apart, enough space to give each other privacy, but close enough to talk from tent to tent without raising our voices. His green dome on the left, my gray backpacker on the right, a gap of dark forest floor between them. We built a fire and cooked dinner, canned chili, bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint, the same meal we'd been cooking on these trips since we were teenagers, and sat in camp chairs and talked the way brothers talk when they've been doing the same thing together for almost 2 decades, comfortably, without urgency, covering ground that ranges from family logistics to childhood memories, to silence that doesn't need filling. The silence is maybe the most important part. We've both become people who need regular access to quiet, and these trips were where we found it. The rain started around 9, a cold, steady rain that hit the hemlock canopy and was broken into 1,000 smaller streams and drips that reached the ground in a constant, irregular patter. We doused the fire, said goodnight, and retreated to our tents. My brother's tent was to my left, a green 2-person dome that he'd owned for years. My tent was a gray 3-season backpacking tent, lightweight, low profile. The 2 tents sat on the bench of ground with the hemlocks towering above and the sound of rain filtering through the canopy. And I fell asleep within 10 minutes. I woke at some point in the deep middle of the night. Not gradually, I woke with the sudden, complete alertness that happens when your subconscious has registered something that your conscious mind needs to evaluate. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened. Rain on the fly, creek in the distance, louder than it had been, swollen with runoff, wind moving the upper canopy in long slow waves, and a sound I couldn't place, a rustling, fabric moving. The sound a tent makes when someone shifts inside it, the scrape of a sleeping bag against nylon, the creak of a tent pole flexing under shifted weight. It was coming from my right, from the side opposite my brother's tent. There should not have been a tent to my right. We were the only people in this section of forest. We'd checked when we arrived. No vehicles on the two-track. No other camps visible in any direction, but the sound was specific and unmistakable. It was the sound of a tent with someone in it, the particular acoustic signature of a human body moving inside a thin-walled enclosure. And it was coming from a position about 15 feet to my right, the same distance that separated my tent from my brother's on the left, as though a third tent had been placed in the symmetrical position on the other side. Completing a row, I lay there and I listened to the sounds of someone moving in a tent that should not have existed. The movements were slow, deliberate, a shift, a pause, another shift. The sound of a zipper, not the tent door, smaller, like a sleeping bag being adjusted. A sigh, soft but audible between the pattering of rain. The sounds of someone settling in for the night, getting comfortable, arranging themselves in their sleeping bag with the particular fussiness of a person who can't quite find the right position. It was so normal, so domestic, so completely ordinary that I almost called out, almost said something like, "Hey, didn't realize someone else was out here," before the wrongness of it caught up to me. No vehicle, no arrival sounds, no footsteps, no tent being pitched, no stakes being driven. The tent, if it was a tent, had appeared in silence while I slept, its occupant already inside, already settled, as though they'd been there all along and I simply hadn't noticed. I reached for my headlamp, I put it on, my hand steady in a way that surprised me because my heartbeat was loud enough to hear. I oriented myself toward the right wall of my tent, toward the sound, and I turned on the lamp. The beam hit the tent wall and illuminated the nylon from inside, turning my tent into a glowing gray rectangle in the dark forest. And through the tent wall, through the translucent fabric, I could see, faintly but unmistakably, the outline of another tent. It was there, about 15 feet away, a dark shape against the darker forest, the size and approximate form of a small dome tent. No light inside it, no glow, no headlamp, no lantern, just a shape. A structure that had not been there when I went to sleep. I turned off my headlamp. I lay back down. My heart was hammering, but my body was still, locked into the rigid immobility that extreme alertness produces. I listened. The sounds from the other tent had stopped the moment I'd turned on my light. Silence from that direction now, complete and total. As though whatever had been moving inside, it had also gone rigid, had also frozen, had also become perfectly still in response to my awareness. We lay there in the dark, in our respective tents, 15 feet apart, in the rain, listening to each other's silence. I did not sleep again. I lay in my tent and I watched the right wall with my headlamp off. And I listened, and I heard nothing more from that direction for the rest of the night. When the light came, slow and gray through the hemlocks, the dawn of an overcast day after rain, I unzipped my tent and looked to the right. There was no tent. The ground was empty. The forest floor was a carpet of hemlock needles, dark and wet, and there was no tent. No impression in the needles, no sign that anything had occupied that space. I walked the 15 feet, and I looked at the ground carefully, the way my job as a land surveyor had trained me to look at ground, reading it for disturbance, for compression, for the subtle signs that weight had been placed and removed. Nothing. The needles lay as they had fallen, undisturbed, continuous, as though nothing had been there at all. I didn't tell my brother that morning. We packed up, drove out, stopped at a diner in Tianesta for breakfast, and ate our eggs and drank our coffee with the comfortable routine of two people finishing a trip they'd taken many times before. I told him 3 weeks later at a family dinner. After 2 beers had loosened the seal I'd put on the experience, he listened, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. And when I finished, he was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that I recognized from our trips. The silence that means someone is sitting with something they don't want to say. Then he told me that he'd woken up that night too. Around the same time, he thought. Though he hadn't checked his watch, he said he'd heard sounds from his right. side from the direction between our tents, from the gap of forest floor that separated his green dome from my gray backpacker. He said it sounded like a third tent, someone moving in nylon. The rustle and creak and sigh of a person settling in. He said he'd assumed it was me, moving around in my tent. The sounds distorted by rain and the acoustic tricks that a forest plays on sounds at night. He said he'd gone back to sleep. We looked at each other across the dinner table with the particular expression of two people who have just realized that the same impossible thing happened to both of them from different angles, and that neither version disproves the other, and that the space between their two tents, a space they had both heard occupied, had been empty in the morning. We still camp in the Alleghenies. We go every October. Because the tradition is older than the fear, and because neither of us wants to be the one who says we should stop. But we pitch our tents side by side, now touching, with no space between them. And on rainy nights when the hemlock canopy drips, and the darkness presses close, and the forest floor is soft and deep, and capable of holding impressions, neither of us mentions what we're listening for. We just lie in our touching tents, and we listen, and we don't talk about it. And the space on either side of us, the space where a third tent could go, stays empty, as far as we know. I worked as a campground host at a state park in the Ozarks for 2 seasons, Roaring River State Park in Barry County, Missouri, at the southern edge of the state where the Ozark Plateau breaks apart into hollows and spring-fed creeks and cave systems that run under the hills like veins under skin. The spring that feeds the river produces 30 million gallons of water a day, rising from a cave mouth at the base of a limestone bluff, with a constancy that makes you understand what people mean when they say the earth is alive. The water comes out at 58 degrees year-round, winter and summer, drought and flood, as though the temperature is a promise that geology made a long time ago and has no intention of breaking. A campground host, if you're unfamiliar with the arrangement, is someone who lives on site in exchange for a free campsite and a small stipend. You're the first point of contact for campers, the person who answers questions about firewood and trash pickup and which trails are closed, and the person who drives the loop after quiet hours to make sure nobody's running a generator or blasting music past 10 p.m. It's a job that attracts retirees and people in transition, and I was the latter. Recently divorced, recently quit from a teaching job I'd held for 9 years, recently arrived at the conclusion that I needed to live in a place where the primary sounds were water and wind rather than traffic and the particular silence that fills a house, where two people have stopped talking to each other. The campground had 40 sites arranged in 2 loops, an upper loop of 28 sites on a wooded hillside, and a lower loop of 12 sites along the spring branch that fed Roaring River. The lower loop was the older section, built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, with stone fire rings and picnic tables made from slabs of native limestone that had been there so long they'd grown lichen on their edges. The lower loop was also consistently the section where problems occurred. Not problems in the campground management sense, noise complaints, overflowing trash, unauthorized pets. Problems in the sense that campers at certain sites, specifically sites 10 through 12 at the far end of the loop, reported experiences that I learned to listen for in their checkout conversations. The reports were always vague and always delivered with a particular kind of embarrassment, the kind that people display when they want to tell you something they know sounds irrational but can't quite let go of. People would mention that they hadn't slept well, that they'd heard sounds they couldn't identify, not animal sounds, not weather sounds, but sounds that didn't fit into any category they had a name for, that the site felt off in a way they couldn't articulate, but that had made them reluctant to leave their tent or camper after dark. One woman, a regular who booked Site 11 every spring, a retired schoolteacher from Springfield, who brought her own folding table and a battery-operated string of lights and treated her campsite with the decorative attention most people reserve for living rooms, told me that she'd woken up during A rainstorm, and felt certain that someone was standing outside her camper, and that when she'd turned on her porch light, the feeling had not gone away, had intensified, in fact, as though the light had confirmed the presence rather than dispelling it, and that she'd sat at her kitchen table until dawn with every light on and the radio playing softly because the silence between the raindrops was worse than the rain itself. She didn't come back the following year. She didn't cancel her reservation. She just didn't show up, and when I called the number on file, she said she'd decided to try a different park, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who has rehearsed an answer. My second season, I decided to spend a night at Site 12, not out of bravery, out of professional curiosity, the kind that comes from hearing enough vague reports that you want to calibrate them against your own experience. Site 12 was the last site on the lower loop, tucked into a bend of the Spring Branch where the water ran through a narrow channel of exposed limestone. The site was heavily shaded by sycamores, their white bark peeling in sheets that lay on the ground like discarded skin. Behind the site, a limestone bluff rose about 40 feet, pocked with small openings. Not caves exactly, but solution features. Places where the water had dissolved the rock over millennia and left hollows that went back a few feet into darkness. I set up a tent at Site 12 on a Tuesday night in early October, when the campground was nearly empty. 3 occupied sites on the upper loop, none on the lower. The forecast called for rain after midnight, which was fine. I'd spent 2 seasons sleeping in the park. I'd heard every sound the forest made, every animal, every weather pattern, every acoustic trick that wind and water could produce in a limestone valley. I ate dinner, read for an hour by lantern light, and got into the tent around 9. The rain arrived at 1:15. I know the time because I was awake. I'd been awake since about 12:30, and had been checking my phone in the way that people do when sleep won't come and the minutes need to be tracked to maintain the illusion of order. The rain started gently and built, and within 20 minutes it was a full storm, the kind the Ozarks produce in autumn when the warm air from the south collides with the cold front pushing down from the plains. Thunder, lightning that illuminated the tent walls in blue-white flashes, rain so heavy that the Spring Branch rose visibly. I could hear the water climbing the channel, the sound changing pitch as the volume increased. At 1:40, during a pause in the thunder, I heard tapping. Small, precise taps on the rain fly of the tent, in a rhythm that was clearly not rain. Rain is random. Each drop lands independently, governed by wind and gravity and the chaos of falling. This was patterned: 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause, deliberate, intentional, like someone knocking politely on a door they expected to be answered. The taps were coming from the side of the tent that faced the limestone bluff. I did not move. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes open, and I listened to 3 more sets of 3 taps, and then the tapping stopped and was replaced by the rain, which continued with its natural randomness for maybe 2 minutes before the tapping resumed. Same pattern, 3 and 3 and 3. This continued for over an hour, tapping in sets of 3, separated by intervals of silence that lasted between 1 and 4 minutes. The tapping never changed in intensity or location. Same spot on the fly, same force, same rhythm, patient, unhurried. The consistency of it was what unnerved me most, because inconsistency is natural, and consistency, in the context of an unexplained sound in the dark, implies something that doesn't get bored, doesn't waver, doesn't lose interest. Something that will tap 3 times and wait, and tap 3 times and wait for as long as it takes. Around 3 in the morning, I realized something that I'd been processing subconsciously but hadn't allowed to surface. The tapping was coming from high on the tent fly, near the peak, at a point that was about 5.5 feet above the ground. If a person were standing beside the tent and tapping the fly with their finger, they would need to be standing with their arm extended above their head. But the tent was pitched with its back wall 3 feet from the limestone bluff. There was barely room for a person to stand between the tent and the rock, and the bluff behind the tent was not vertical at that point. It angled outward, an overhang that leaned over the tent like a wave frozen in stone, to reach the point on the fly where the tapping was occurring. From the space between the tent and the bluff, something would have to be reaching over the overhang, reaching down from the bluff face, tapping from above, which meant that whatever was tapping was not standing on the ground, it was on the rock. The tapping stopped at 3:22. I know because I was counting minutes by then. Each one a small victory of endurance. The rain continued until dawn, and I lay in the tent and I listened to it, and I did not hear the tapping again. In the morning, the storm had passed and the sky was clear, and the spring branch was high and fast, and the sycamores were dripping, and the air smelled like wet limestone, which has a mineral sweetness to it, like the ghost of the ocean that deposited the rock. 400 million years ago, I walked behind the tent and I looked at the bluff face. The limestone was wet, dark with moisture, and on the overhang directly above the spot where the tapping had been, there were marks in the lichen, not scratches, compressions, places where the lichen had been pressed flat against the rock by something gripping it. The compressions were arranged in a pattern that I looked at for a long time before I understood what I was seeing. Fingers, the marks of fingers, gripping the overhang from above. 4 compressions in a row with a gap where a thumb might anchor against the upper surface. But the fingers, based on the spacing and the size of each compression, were too long. Half again as long as a human finger, at least with a span that suggested a hand that could wrap around a softball. I dismantled the tent and I carried it back to my host site, and I wrote up a maintenance request suggesting that Site 12 be closed for drainage concerns. It was closed for the rest of the season. As far as I know, it was reopened the following spring after I'd moved on to a different park in a different state. I don't know if the new host received the same reports. I don't know if the tapping continued. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw on that overhang, and I know that the hollows in that bluff go back farther than anyone has mapped, into limestone that has been dissolving and reshaping itself since before anything walked on land. And I know that some of those hollows are large enough for something to live in, something patient, something with long fingers and a habit of knocking 3 times and waiting. I grew up on the Loxahatchee River in Martin County, Florida, in a house my parents built on a half-acre lot that backed onto a cypress strand at the edge of the river's floodplain. Camping for us didn't mean driving somewhere, it meant walking 100 yards into the cypress strand and pitching a tent on a hammock of dry ground among the knees and buttresses of trees that had been standing since before the county was incorporated. My father started taking me out there when I was 8, and by the time I was 12 I was going alone, sleeping in the strand on Friday nights, with a mosquito net and a flashlight, and the particular fearlessness that children have when a dangerous place is also a familiar one. The Loxahatchee is a blackwater river, which means the water is stained dark by tannins leaching from decaying vegetation. And in certain lights, early morning, late afternoon, overcast days, the surface looks like tea or oil or something. Older than either, the river is slow tidal in its lower reaches, and the floodplain on either side is a maze of cypress strands, sawgrass marshes, and hammocks of live oak and cabbage palm that sit a foot or two above the waterline and serve as islands of dry ground in a landscape that is fundamentally a river pretending to be land. The wildlife is dense and loud: alligators, otters, limpkins, barred owls that call to each other across the strand with a sound like someone asking who cooks for you, in a voice that carries a mile through still air. The night I'm telling you about was in August, the deep middle of the South Florida wet season, when the afternoon thunderstorms come every day at 3:30, like a train running on a schedule, and the humidity stays above 90% until the following morning. I was 16, and I'd gone out to the strand for a Friday night camp, with the intention of doing nothing more complicated than lying in a hammock and reading by headlamp and falling asleep to the sound of the river moving through the cypress roots. The forecast was for storms overnight, which in August in South Florida is not news. Its background: the storms come. They drop an inch of rain in 30 minutes. They move east toward the ocean. And the air cools by exactly 3 degrees before. The humidity reasserts itself. I set up on my usual hammock, a slightly elevated mound about 50 yards into the strand from our backyard fence. The hammock was maybe 20 feet across, dry and firm, carpeted with sword fern and leaf litter, with cypress trees on 3 sides and a view through to the river channel on the 4th. I could see the water from my tent, a strip of black surface maybe 30 feet wide, moving imperceptibly south, reflecting the sky or absorbing it, depending on the light. I ate a sandwich, read for an hour, and turned off my headlamp around 10. The frogs were deafening. The particular chorus of tree frogs and pig frogs that performs every summer night in South Florida. A wall of sound so constant that your brain stops processing it as noise and starts processing it as silence. The storm came at midnight, not. Gradually, it arrived as a wall of wind that hit the canopy like a truck, bending the cypress trees sideways and sending a shower of bark and Spanish moss onto my tent. Then the rain, instantaneous and total. A volume of water falling from the sky that made the tent fly sag under the weight and turned the hammock's leaf litter into a shallow stream that ran under my ground cloth. Thunder so close that the flash and the sound were simultaneous, the light turning the inside of my tent white, and the sound arriving not as a boom, but as a physical force, a compression of air that I felt in my chest. I'd been through hundreds of these storms. They didn't scare me. What scared me was what happened to the frogs. They stopped, all of them, simultaneously. Mid-chorus, mid-note, the entire population of frogs in the cypress strand went silent at the same moment, as though someone had thrown a switch. This doesn't happen. Frogs don't coordinate. They don't respond to storms by going silent. If anything, rain stimulates calling. A sudden predator can silence frogs in a localized area. A ripple of quiet spreading outward from the threat. But this was total. Every frog in every direction, as far as I could hear, stopped calling at the same instant. The silence was more shocking than any sound could have been, because the frog chorus had been so loud and so constant that its absence created a vacuum, a negative space in the soundscape that was almost painful in its emptiness. The storm continued, wind, rain, thunder, but the frogs were silent, and in that silence, under the storm noise, I heard the river, not the normal sound of the river, which was a gentle murmur, a tidal whisper of water moving through roots and over limestone. This was different. The river was rising. I could hear it. The sound of water climbing, spreading, moving laterally out of its channel and into the floodplain with a speed that was wrong. The Loxahatchee floods gradually, over days in response to sustained rainfall. It doesn't flash flood. The terrain is too flat, the drainage too wide. But I could hear water moving into the strand, could hear it spreading through the fern and the leaf litter, approaching the hammock from the riverside with a sound like something breathing in, a long sustained inhalation of water being pulled in a direction that water doesn't normally go. I turned on my headlamp and unzipped the tent door. The beam hit the water. The hammock was surrounded. What had been dry ground with the river 30 feet away was now an island in a rising sheet of dark water that was lapping at the edge of my tent platform with the gentle, insistent rhythm of a tide. But it wasn't a tide. The Loxahatchee's tidal influence is minimal this far upstream, and the water was fresh. I could see the tannin color in my headlamp beam, the familiar tea-brown of the river. The river had left its channel and spread across the floodplain in the time since the storm started, maybe 20 minutes, rising at a rate that should have been physically impossible given the topography. I watched the water for several minutes. It was still rising. Slowly now, but rising, the edge creeping closer to my tent by inches, and the water was moving in a way that bothered me. A way I couldn't articulate at first because it was subtle and because my 16-year-old mind was processing fear before analysis. The water was not flowing. It was not moving downstream. The surface was rising evenly like a bathtub filling. the level increasing uniformly across the entire visible area of the floodplain. No current, no directional flow, just water accumulating, as though the rain was falling and the ground was refusing to absorb it, and the river was refusing to carry it away. And then, in the beam of my headlamp, maybe 15 feet from the edge of the hammock, the water moved, not the flat, even rise of the flood. A disturbance, a displacement, something under the surface pushing water aside as it moved, creating a wake without breaking the surface. A bulge in the water about 4 feet long that traveled in a slow arc around the edge of the hammock. I told myself it was an alligator. Alligators are common in the Strand, common in flood conditions, and a 4-foot disturbance on the water's surface is consistent with a gator cruising below. But gators create wakes with a specific pattern. The V-shaped ripple of a body moving forward through water. This was different. This was a bulge, a dome of water, as though something was rising from below without quite reaching the surface. Something that was moving around my hammock the way the footsteps in other people's stories circle campsites, with that same slow, deliberate circumnavigation that suggests assessment rather than predation. It completed one circuit and started another, closer. The frogs were still silent. The storm was still raging. The water was still rising, and the dome of displaced water was circling my hammock with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Because the water was its time, and the water wasn't going anywhere. I stayed on the hammock. I watched it circle 3 times, each pass bringing it a foot or two closer to the dry ground where I sat. On the 3rd pass, it stopped at the closest point to my position and held there, the dome of water stationary, facing me, if facing is the right word for something that had no visible features. No face, no body, just volume displaced in dark water, a presence defined entirely by the space it occupied. It held there for maybe a minute. Then it sank, the dome flattened, the surface smoothed, and whatever had been displacing that water descended or dispersed or simply stopped existing in the form I could perceive. The frogs came back, not gradually. They resumed at full volume, mid-chorus, as though unpaused. The water receded by morning. The river was back in its channel. The Strand was wet but passable. I walked home through the fern and the cypress knees, and I didn't tell my parents because I didn't have words for what I'd seen, and because the part of me that had grown up in that landscape knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that what I'd experienced was not new. The river had been doing this longer than our house had been there. The cypress trees had seen it. The frogs knew when to stop singing. The Loxahatchee is a managed waterway now, channelized in sections, controlled by water management districts, measured and monitored and regulated. But the water remembers what it was before the management. And on rainy nights in August, when the storms come and the floodplain fills, it still moves in ways that the gauges don't record and the models don't predict. I haven't camped in the Strand since I left for college, but my parents still live in that house. And my mother told me once, casually, over the phone, that she'd noticed the frogs go silent during a storm and that the yard had flooded in a way the drainage should have prevented. She said it was strange. She said the water seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the ground was exhaling it. I told her it was just the rain. I didn't tell her what I'd seen circling in the dark. I teach field ecology at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, and every September I take a group of 12 students into the Green Mountain National Forest for a 4-day backcountry research trip. We hike into a base camp on the Long Trail near Stratton Mountain, set up our tents, and spend 3 days collecting data on soil composition, canopy density, and invertebrate populations in the understory. It's the highlight of my academic year, the reason I took the job, frankly. The opportunity to do real fieldwork with students who are young enough to still find wet socks and cold mornings exciting rather than miserable. The Long Trail is the oldest long-distance hiking trail in the United States, built starting in 1910, and the section near Stratton runs along a ridgeline at about 3,200 feet where the forest transitions from northern hardwood to boreal. the maples and birches giving way to balsam fir and red spruce in a gradient you can watch happen in real time as you climb, the canopy getting shorter and denser, the air getting cooler and wetter. The forest closing in around you with an intimacy that feels protective if you're used to it and suffocating if you're not. The trip I'm going to tell you about was September of 2021. My 6th year running the program. We hiked in on a Monday. 14 of us total, 12 students, myself, and a teaching assistant named Clara who had done the trip with me the previous year and who had the particular competence of a graduate student who has decided that fieldwork is her life and has organized her personality accordingly. The weather was clear when we started, but the forecast showed a front moving in Tuesday night, with rain expected through Wednesday morning. Standard September weather for the Green Mountains, where the transition from summer to autumn is marked by a series of cold fronts that push through the Champlain Valley and climb the western slopes and dump their moisture on the ridgeline with a reliability that makes the rain feel less like weather and more like a feature of the landscape, something the mountain produces rather than receives. We made base camp on a flat bench below the summit of Stratton, at an elevation of about 3,200 feet, in a dense stand of balsam fir and red spruce that smelled the way the word forest should smell. Resinous, cool, clean in a way that makes suburban air seem like a pollutant by comparison. The students set up their tents in pairs. 6 tents arranged in a loose semicircle around a central cooking area. Clara and I pitched our tents at the ends of the semicircle, bookending the students. My tent was on the north end, closest to the trail. Tuesday was a full day of fieldwork, quadrant surveys, soil cores, canopy photographs, pitfall trap collection. The students worked in teams, recording data on waterproof field sheets, labeling specimens, arguing about species identification with the passionate certainty that characterizes people who have just learned enough to be confident and not yet enough to be humble. By dinner, everyone was tired and happy and smelling like the forest and talking loudly around the cook stoves. The clouds rolled in at sunset, a gray ceiling that descended onto the ridge like a lid being placed on a pot. By 8 o'clock, first drops were hitting the fir canopy. I told everyone to secure their sights and get into their tents. Rain on the long trail at elevation is not recreational. The temperature drops, the wind picks up, and the exposed ridge becomes a channel that funnels weather through the camp with a directness that feels intentional. By 9, the rain was steady and the camp was quiet. I could hear the murmur of students talking in their tents, the occasional laugh, the sounds of people settling into sleeping bags and preparing to wait out the weather. I fell asleep around 10. I woke at 1:17. According to my watch, the rain was heavier now, the kind that turns the forest floor into a network of small streams, and the wind was pushing through the fir stand with a sound like sustained applause. I was awake because of a sound, a voice, not loud, not close, but clear enough to resolve into words through the rain and the wind. Someone was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The voice was coming from beyond the camp perimeter, from the trail side, north of my tent. It was calm, measured, unhurried, a voice counting to 5 and starting over, with the regularity of a metronome or a meditation exercise. It was not a voice I recognized. My first thought was that a student had gotten up and was doing some kind of breathing exercise on the trail. Some of my students practice meditation. It wouldn't have been unusual, but the voice was wrong for that. It was too even, too controlled, too devoid of the natural variation that a human voice produces. When a person counts, they inflect differently, on different numbers, emphasis on 1, a rise on 3, a finality on 5. This voice gave every number the same weight, the same pitch, the same duration, flat, mechanical. The way a voice sounds when the counting is not for the counters' benefit but for someone else's. I unzipped my tent and put my head out. The rain hit my face immediately, cold and sharp. I pointed my headlamp toward the trail. The beam reached maybe 50 feet through the rain before the fir trees absorbed it. I couldn't see anyone. The voice continued. 1, 2, 3, 5. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Coming. From the darkness beyond my headlamp's reach, from the trail or just off it, stationary, not moving, I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" The counting stopped. The rain fell. The wind moved through the firs. Silence from the trail. I waited 30 seconds, a minute, nothing. I pulled my head back into the tent and zipped it shut and told myself that I'd heard. The wind shaping itself into patterns that my sleeping brain had interpreted as a voice. At 1:39, the counting resumed. Same voice, same cadence, same flat, even delivery. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But closer, noticeably closer. As though whoever was counting had moved toward the camp during the silence, had used the minutes when I was listening for them to close the distance by 20 or 30 feet. I lay in my tent and I listened, and I did not call out again because calling out had moved it closer, and I did not want to learn what happened when it arrived. The counting continued for another 40 minutes. In that time, it grew incrementally closer with each cycle. Not during the counting. The source remained stationary while it counted. It moved during the pauses. Each silence between cycles was a step closer, a closing of distance that I could track by the increasing clarity of the voice, by the way the rain stopped masking it and the words became crisper and more defined. By 2:20, the voice was at the edge of camp, close enough that I could hear details, the slight click of the consonants, the breath between numbers, the mechanical precision of a voice that was performing a function rather than communicating. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each number now clear and separate and close enough that it sounded like someone standing just outside my tent, counting in the rain with their face turned toward the nylon and their mouth 6 inches from where I lay. And then it stopped. Not a pause, an ending. The counting ceased and it did not resume. The rain continued. The wind continued. The forest continued its collective breathing of 1,000 fir trees moving coordinated waves. But the voice was gone. I lay in my tent until dawn. And in the morning I asked Clara, whose tent had been at the south end of the semicircle, whether she'd heard anything in the night. She said she'd slept through the rain. I asked the students, casually, over breakfast. None of them had heard anything unusual. None of them had gotten up. None of them had been counting. I checked the trail near my tent. The mud showed boot prints, hours from the previous days. Fieldwork and rain-pocked earth and the small streams that overnight water carves through forest soil. No fresh prints. No sign of anyone approaching the camp from the north. We finished the trip, collected our data, hiked out on Thursday in clearing weather, drove back to campus with the students sleeping in the back of the van and Clara navigating from the passenger seat, and neither of us mentioning the rain or the night or anything that happened between 1:17 and 2:20 on that Tuesday. I've done the September trip every year since. The data we collect is good. The students learn things they can't learn in a classroom. And the forest is still the place where I feel most like the version of myself I was meant to be. But I position my tent at the south end of the semicircle now, and I let Clara have the north end. And I haven't told her why, because telling her would require me to describe the voice in terms that I'm not confident are accurate. And because the thing that disturbs me most about that night isn't the counting itself, it's the way the counting felt directed, not at me specifically, but at the camp, at the collection of sleeping bodies arranged in a semicircle in the rain, as though whatever was counting was doing the same thing we'd been doing all day, taking inventory, collecting data, documenting what it found, and on rainy nights, when the fir canopy roars and the camp goes quiet and the students sleep with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of people who have spent all day working in the woods, I lie awake and I listen for the counting. I haven't heard it again, but I've noticed that I count things more than I used to. Steps from the tent to the cook area, trees in the semicircle, students at breakfast. I count them. And I count them again, and I can't quite explain why stopping at 5 feels wrong, like an answer to a question I didn't ask, like the beginning of a sequence that someone else is keeping track of. I spent a year working as a wilderness therapy guide in the Gila National Forest in southwestern New Mexico, leading groups of troubled teenagers on multi-week backcountry expeditions through some of the most remote terrain in the lower 48. The Gila is 3 million acres of ponderosa pine and mixed conifer and high desert, cut through by canyon systems so deep and so narrow that GPS doesn't work in the bottoms, and the only way to navigate is by map and the position of the sun and the particular knowledge of the landscape that you accumulate through repetition and error and the slow, painful process of getting lost enough times that the terrain starts to make sense. The nearest town of any size is Silver City, 40 miles south, and from most of the places we camped, Silver City might as well have been on the moon. The Gila is a place where the concept of nearby loses its meaning, and distance is measured not in miles, but in the number of canyon rims you'd have to cross to reach anything that resembled civilization. The program ran year-round, which meant I worked through the monsoon season, July through September, when the desert sky builds thunderheads every afternoon that stack 40,000 feet into the atmosphere, and then collapse in storms that drop more water in 30 minutes than the preceding 3 months combined. The monsoon transforms the Gila. The arroyos flash flood. The creeks go from dry gravel to chest-deep torrents in the time it takes to eat lunch, and the canyons become drainage channels for entire watersheds, funneling water down from the high mesas in rivers that appear from nothing and disappear into nothing and leave behind a landscape scoured and rearranged. Creek beds relocated, boulders moved, the canyon floor rewritten overnight like a document that the water edits every time it passes through. The sound of water in a desert canyon is one of the most unsettling sounds in nature, because it's a sound that doesn't belong there. A sound that the landscape is not shaped to contain. A sound that means the rules have temporarily changed. We camped in the canyons. We had to. The ridges were exposed to lightning. The slopes were too steep for tents, and the canyon floors were the only flat ground available. We chose our sites carefully, always above the flood line, always with an escape route to higher ground, always with the knowledge that the weather could turn the landscape hostile in minutes. The teenagers didn't understand the danger, which was one of the therapeutic points. Learning to respect a landscape that doesn't care about you, learning that the world has forces in it that are indifferent to your problems. The night I want to tell you about was in August, in a canyon called Turkey Creek, a deep slot in the Mogollon Mountains that runs east to west and opens onto the Gila River about 8 miles from the nearest road. I had a group of 6 kids, 4 boys and 2 girls, ages 15 to 17, and a co-guide named Marcus who had been doing this work longer than I had and who moved through the Gila with the quiet competence of someone who had internalized the landscape so deeply that navigation was less a skill than a sense. We'd set camp on a bench of ground about 20 feet above the creek bed, backed against a cliff of volcanic tuff that provided shelter from the afternoon storms and radiated the day's heat back at us through the evening, keeping the campsite warm well after the sun dropped behind the canyon rim. The storm that night was violent even by monsoon standards. It hit at about 9. A wall of wind and water that descended into the canyon like something being poured from above. The lightning was continuous, not individual strikes, but a sustained flickering that illuminated the canyon walls in a strobe effect, turning the tough cliffs into something hallucinatory. The texture of the rock appearing and disappearing in rapid succession, like frames of a film. The kids were in their tarps. We used tarps rather than tents, part of the program's emphasis on minimal gear and direct exposure to the environment, and I could hear some of them whimpering, which was normal. Monsoon storms in a narrow canyon are genuinely terrifying, even if you've experienced them before. Marcus and I were under our own tarp, awake, monitoring the creek level by sound. This was standard protocol during monsoon camping. You listened to the water, and you estimated its volume, and you made the call to move to higher ground. If the sound crossed a threshold that you learned to recognize through experience rather than measurement, the creek was rising but manageable. A steady rush that hadn't yet reached the harsh, grinding roar that indicates a flash flood carrying debris. We were watching. We were ready. Around 10:30, Marcus touched my arm. He didn't say anything. He pointed down the canyon, east, in the direction the creek flowed toward the Gila. I looked in the lightning flashes, between the strobe pulses of illumination that showed the canyon walls and the rain-curtained air and the dark rush of the creek below us. I saw figures walking up the creek bed, coming toward us from downstream. In the creek, not beside it, not on the bank, in the water, in the flood. Walking against the current and water that was by that point knee-deep and moving fast enough to roll stones. I counted 3 of them in the next flash, then the dark, then a flash, 4. They were walking in a single file, evenly spaced, moving upstream with a pace that was steady and unhurried, despite the current pushing against them. The lightning made it impossible to see detail. Each flash was a fraction of a second, and the figures were maybe 100 yards downstream, visible only as dark shapes against the lighter color of the water. Upright, bipedal, moving with coordination. My first thought was hikers. Other groups used Turkey Creek. Maybe someone had gotten caught in the storm. Maybe they were wading upstream to find higher ground. But hikers don't walk upstream in a flash flood. Hikers get out of the water. Hikers don't walk in single file through a flooded creek bed at 10:30 at night during a lightning storm with the mechanical. Even spacing of a military patrol. Marcus and I watched them for about 2 minutes. They came closer, in the last clear flash before the storm's intensity peaked, and the rain became so heavy that visibility dropped to 10 feet. I saw one of them, clearly, just for a fraction of a second, just the shape of a figure illuminated by lightning against the white churn of the flooded creek. It was tall, taller than anyone in our group, taller than Marcus, who was 6'2". It was walking upright, arms at its sides, head if it was a head, tilted slightly forward, into the rain, into the current. And then the dark we didn't see. Them again. The storm peaked around 11 and began to ease at midnight, the lightning retreating east down the canyon, the rain softening from a downpour to a steady fall to a mist. The creek stayed high through the night, and Marcus and I stayed awake, listening, watching the canyon and the brief natural illuminations that the receding storm provided. Nothing moved in the creek. Nothing walked upstream. The kids slept through it. Or most of them did. In the morning, the creek was back to ankle depth. The canyon floor was scoured clean by the flood, and the sky was the deep, impossible blue that the desert produces after monsoon storms. A blue so saturated, it looks artificial. I asked Marcus about it while the kids were eating breakfast. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that he'd seen them before, twice. Both times during monsoon storms, both times in deep canyons, both times walking upstream in the floodwater. He said the Dean people, some of whom he'd worked with in other programs, had a concept of beings that traveled in floodwater, that used the water the way people use roads, moving through the landscape along channels that only existed when the water was running. He said they weren't considered dangerous. They were considered old. He said the word he'd been told translated roughly to the ones who walk when the water walks. He said you weren't supposed to follow them upstream. You weren't supposed to try to see where they came from. You were supposed to stay on your bench and let them pass and understand that the canyon, during a flood, belonged to them. And you were a guest in a space that was briefly theirs. We finished the expedition. The kids completed their objectives, wrote their reflections, hiked out to the trailhead where their parents waited with clean clothes and fast food and the particular anxious relief of adults who have entrusted their children to a wilderness for 3 weeks and gotten them back alive. I guided 3 more groups through the Gila that monsoon season. I never saw the figures again, but I was never in Turkey Creek during a nighttime storm again, either. And I suspect the two things are related. I suspect that what we saw wasn't rare but was instead specific, tied to that canyon and that water and those particular conditions of darkness and flood that we were unlikely to replicate, because I made sure, in the remaining months of my tenure, that we never camped in a narrow canyon during a forecast monsoon event. I told myself it was safety protocol. It was. I left the wilderness therapy job the following spring for reasons that had nothing to do with this experience and everything to do with the unsustainable emotional weight of working with teenagers in crisis, with children who were so damaged by the world that the world had sent them to the desert to be repaired by weather and rock, and the enforced simplicity of walking from one place to another with everything you need on your back. But I think about Turkey Creek. I think about the figures walking upstream in the flood with the patience of something that has been doing it for longer than the canyon has had a name. I think about Marcus's face in the lightning, the way he watched them without surprise, as though he was seeing something he'd been told about and was now simply confirming. And I think about the creek bed in the morning, scoured clean, holding no footprints, no evidence, nothing but wet gravel and the fading sound of water retreating to its dry season whisper, as though the flood had come and gone and taken everything. With it, everything it had brought, everything it had shown us, every trace of the ones who walk when the water walks, return to wherever they go when the arroyos dry and the canyons go back to being made of dust and light and silence. My father died in March of 2020, 3 days before the world shut down. The timing meant that his funeral was small. Just my mother and me and 2 of his friends who drove up from Bangor in the rain to stand in a cemetery in Greenville, Maine, at the southern tip of Moosehead Lake, and watch a box go into the ground while the wind came off the ice and cut through our coats with a coldness that felt personal. After the funeral, after the friends left, and my mother went inside, and the pandemic closed the borders between the life we'd had and whatever came next, I did the thing my father would have done. I went camping. My father had been a Maine guide, not in the commercial sense, though he'd guided fishing trips on Moosehead for 30 years, but in the deeper sense, the sense that means he knew the woods the way some people know language, instinctively, structurally, with a fluency that made the forest legible to him in ways it wasn't to most people. He'd taught me to camp on the islands in Moosehead Lake, which is 40 miles long and contains more than 80 islands, some of them large enough to have their own interior forests, and some of them barely more than a pile of granite, with a few spruce trees clinging to the rock. The state maintained primitive campsites on several of the islands, fire rings, pit toilets, cleared tent pads, accessible only by boat. My father and I had camped on most of them in late September, 6 months after his death. I put his canoe in the water at Rockwood Landing and paddled north. The canoe was an Old Town Tripper, green fiberglass, 17 feet long, with the particular glide that a well-designed hull produces, a feeling of being carried by the water, rather than fighting it. My father had owned it since before I was born. He'd repaired the hull twice, once with a fiberglass patch and once with a prayer and some marine epoxy. And the canoe bore those repairs the way an old face bears its scars, as evidence of continued use rather than decline. I paddled to an island called Deer Island, about 4 miles north of Rockwood, a low granite hump covered in spruce and fir, with 2 designated campsites on its eastern shore. I'd camped there with my father at least a dozen times, always at Site 1, the closer of the 2 sites, which had a broad view of the lake and a fire ring positioned so that you could sit and watch the sunset light travel across the water and up the slopes of Big Spencer Mountain on the eastern shore. Site 2 was at the far end of the island, tucked into a cove on the north side, sheltered from the prevailing wind, more isolated. My father had never liked Site 2. He'd never told me why. I took Site 1, set up my tent, built a fire, cooked dinner, performed the rituals of camping with the mechanical precision of a person who was going through the motions of a thing that used to bring joy, and hoping that the motions would bring the joy back. The lake was calm, the sky was clear, and the only sounds were the fire and the loons and the water lapping at the granite shore with the patient, repetitive rhythm of something that has been doing the same thing for 10,000 years and will continue for 10,000 more. I went to bed at dark and fell asleep listening to the lake. Rain woke me. Sometime after midnight, the sky had closed, and the rain was falling with a steady windless intensity that turned the lake's surface from glass to static. I could hear it on the tent fly, on the granite, on the water. 3 distinct textures of rain creating a layered sound that was almost orchestral. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened, and I thought about my father and the particular silence he would have maintained in a moment like this. The way he could sit in weather without commenting on it, without needing to narrate his experience, just presenting it with a completeness that I envied and have never managed to replicate. That's when I heard the paddle. The sound of a canoe paddle entering water is distinctive. A soft plunge, a pull, a lift, a drip, if you've spent time on the water. You can hear it through rain, through wind, through the ambient noise of a lake at night. Someone was paddling, close. The sound was coming from the water off the eastern shore, from the direction of the open lake, and it was approaching the island with the steady rhythmic cadence of someone who knew how to paddle, not the splashy, irregular strokes of a novice, but the quiet, efficient dip-pull-lift of someone who had been doing it for decades. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. The paddling continued, growing closer, and then I heard the sound that every canoeist knows, the gentle scrape of a hull on granite. The sound of a canoe being landed on a rocky shore. It came from the north end of the island, from the direction of Site 2. Someone had paddled to the island in the rain, in the middle of the night, and landed at the far campsite. I checked my watch, 1:45 in the morning. I should have gone back to sleep. People camp on islands, people arrive late. The sites were first come first served, and someone paddling in at night, while unusual, was not impossible. But my father's discomfort with Site 2 was in my mind, a small, persistent note that hummed beneath my rational processing like a frequency, just below the threshold of hearing. I lay awake and I listened. No sounds of camp being made, no tent being pitched, no fire being built, no voices, no footsteps on the granite. Just the rain and the lake and the silence of someone who had arrived and was now, apparently, simply sitting at the far end of the island in the dark. Around 2:30, I heard something else, faint, carried on the wet air from the north end of the island, distorted by rain and distance but recognizable, humming. Someone was humming. Not a melody I could identify, a formless tonal hum, the kind of sound a person makes when they're sitting alone and not thinking about the sound they're making. A sound produced by habit or comfort rather than intention, low, steady, continuous. The hum of someone sitting in the rain at a campsite on an island in the middle of a 40-mile lake at 2:30 in the morning. And the sound was familiar, not the tune, the quality, the timbre, the particular resonance of a voice humming through a chest cavity that I recognized the way you recognize a parent's footsteps on a staircase. Not by analysis, but by the accumulated data of a lifetime of hearing. It sounded like my father. I need to say that plainly because if I dress it up in qualifications, I'll lose the truth of it. The humming sounded like my father. The pitch, the rhythm, the way the notes wandered without arriving anywhere. The particular vibration that I had heard 10,000 times sitting beside fires on islands in this lake. It sounded like him, and I knew it wasn't him because he was in the ground in Greenville. 6 months in the ground, and the dead don't paddle canoes to islands in the rain. I knew that. I know that I did not go to Site 2. I lay in my tent and I listened to the humming for maybe 45 minutes, and then it stopped and the rain continued. And I fell asleep in the way that grief sometimes allows, not restfully, but completely. A collapse into unconsciousness that is the body's override of a mind that has reached its limit. In the morning, the rain had stopped and the lake was flat, and the sky was the washed gray of a Maine autumn morning. I packed my camp slowly, and then I walked the trail to Site 2. The site was empty. The fire ring was cold, filled with old ash from a previous camper. The tent pad was bare. The granite shore showed no scrape marks from a hull, no sign that a canoe had been landed. But the site was not quite undisturbed. On the picnic table, in the center of the wooden surface, there was a pile of small stones, 5 of them smooth lake stones, stacked carefully, largest to smallest. A cairn about 4 inches tall, the kind of thing my father used to build. He built them everywhere, on shorelines, on trails, on picnic tables. He called them markers. He said they were how you let someone know you'd been there. I looked at the stones for a long time. I didn't touch them. I walked back to Site 1, and I loaded the canoe, and I paddled south to Rockwood, and I drove to Greenville. And I sat in my mother's kitchen, and I drank coffee, and I didn't tell her what I'd heard or what I'd found, because I didn't know what it meant, and because some experiences are better held than explained. I've been back to Moosehead many times since. I've paddled past Deer Island. I've looked at the dark shore of the North Cove where Site 2 sits under its canopy of spruce. I haven't landed there. My father knew something about that site that he never told me. And I think I understand now why he never told me. Some places hold things, not ghosts. That's too simple a word. Too defined, too certain. Something more like memory, pressed into the granite and the water and the air. A residue of presence that accumulates over decades and centuries, and that reveals itself under certain conditions. Rain, darkness, solitude, grief. The lake is old. The islands are older. And the things that happen on them at night, in the rain, when you're alone with your loss and the water is close enough to touch, are not things that fit neatly into the categories we've built for understanding the world. The loons still call. At dusk, the water still laps at the granite, and somewhere on the north shore of Deer Island, a small cairn of stones may still be standing, placed by hands that I cannot account for, marking a presence I cannot explain.